I don't usually start a speech quoting Mao Zedong. I don't think I've ever done it before, but here's a great one. Everything under heaven is utter chaos. The situation is excellent. So apparently that's a very well-known saying, but nobody seems to know where it came from. On the 15th of July, May's Brexit withdrawal deal, the product of more than 2 years of convoluted, drawn-out negotiations with the EU, was overwhelmingly defeated in the House of Commons by 230 votes. That is 202 for the deal and 432 against. 118 out of 317 Tory MPs voted against this deal. This is the largest defeat suffered by a Prime Minister in modern history. The last time there was a defeat of such proportions was when Ramsay MacDonald's minority Labour government was defeated on the 8th of October 1924 by 166 votes. In fact, it was defeated twice on the same day. The second one was 161 votes. Do you know what the defeat was about? Very interesting. Possibly the most interesting part of this talk. It was called the Campbell case. And the Campbell case of 1924 involved charges against a British communist newspaper editor for alleged incitement to mutiny, caused by his publication of a provocative open letter to members of the military, actually telling them not to shoot fellow workers. And the Labour government, interestingly enough, suspended prosecution of the case, and it was defeated by Liberals and Conservatives in the House of Commons. That seems to me to be a very interesting story. The Campbell was J.R. Campbell, and a number of others were indicted, and they ended up in prison for 1 year or less. So interestingly, this incredible defeat for May's Brexit deal has led to some knowledge of an important struggle in the British working class movement by communists in 1924. Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn announced after the vote that he had tabled a formal motion of no confidence in the government, backed by other party leaders, which MPs were to vote on the next day, that is today. A vote the government will almost certainly win after the DUP and the Jacob Rees-Mogg pro-Brexit European Research Group made it clear they would support the government. In fact, it's just been announced about 7 minutes ago that the victory for the May government was by 325 votes to 306. That is a victory of 19. So, I mean, the normal victory should be with the DUP voting on the side of the government, should be about 13. So it looks as though 6, maybe Labour MPs, I don't know, but 6 others voted on the government side. May announced that if she survives the no confidence vote, she would meet senior parliamentarians from all parties to identify what would be required to secure the backing of the House. May's spokesman refused to say whether he would meet the leaders of the Labour Party and SNP at Westminster. May, it is said, would approach the talks trying to find a solution that would abide by the results of the EU referendum. And this, of course, would rule out talks with those wanting a second referendum or a full customs union. So the chaos and deadlock in the Commons will necessarily continue. Yeah, and I will have to continue writing about it, which is the worst aspect of the whole situation. Since we made clear our position as communists to boycott the EU referendum of 23rd of June 2016, there have been a further 9 articles on Brexit in our newspaper, Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism. It looks like, as I have indicated, there could be quite a few more still to come. Many have been encouraged to treat the Brexit debate as boring, with only the media elites promoting and debating positions on the central issues. This view is ideologically dangerous. Latest developments have shown that not only do we have a disintegrating minority government with a Prime Minister drained of all authority and dependent on the deeply reactionary pro-Brexit DUP, Democratic Unionist Party, to stay in power, but a divided ruling class facing the most significant strategic decision about the future path for British imperialism. In the referendum of June 2016, as Kat has indicated, we were essentially being asked to choose between an imperialist Britain within an imperialist EU and an imperialist Britain outside of it as a junior partner of US imperialism. Divisions in the ruling class in relation with the EU began to emerge most strongly within the Conservative Party in the 1980s with the growing crisis of British capitalism. Michael Heseltine, previously a cabinet minister in Thatcher's government and later to challenge her in the Conservative leadership contest, made the case for Britain's future as part of the European Union in 1989 when he said, "The conditions which made it possible for Britain to be semi-detached from Europe for so long have vanished forever. There is no empire to sustain us. We are no longer an industrial superpower. We can no longer pretend that Britain is in any sense an equal partner of the United States. There is nowhere for us to go except as part of a European consortium." A growing number of Tory MPs, however, incredibly believed Britain could go it alone as an independent global power out of the EU. Since the time of the first referendum on the EU in 1975, there has been a very significant change in the attitude of the British Labour movement to Europe. At the beginning of the 1990s, it had become increasingly clear that British imperialism could no longer sustain a social democratic state alone. For sections of the British Labour movement, a Keynesian welfare state was no longer sustainable on a national basis. A European-wide Keynesianism was seen as a more viable alternative, with British imperialism becoming a significant player within a European imperialist bloc. Sections of left MPs within the Labour Party had already started the push for a new strategy towards Europe, putting their own opportunist gloss on the issues at stake. Typical were the Labour MPs at that time, Ken Livingstone and Harry Barnes, when they said democratic socialists must build for a European future, placing social welfare and democracy on the agenda. On its own, the sovereign nation state is no longer up to the job of dealing with the many pressing issues such as the power of multinational corporations, ecological crises, new technology investment, and the conversion of defence industries. The socialist project, they said, goes through Europe, or it probably goes nowhere. Yet sections of the Labour Party and some groups and unions on the left see the EU, with its regulations on state aid, privatisation and competition, as a barrier to progressive socialist advances in imperialist Britain. Typical are those followers of Tony Benn's standpoint. Benn had written in the Morning Star on the 23rd of May 1979 that Britain had moved, this is imperialist Britain, had moved from empire to colony status. It is a colony in which the IMF decides our monetary policy, the international and multinational companies decided our industrial policy, and the EEC, that's what it was called in those days, decided our legislative and taxation policies. Yes, the great socialist Tony Benn, regarded British imperialism as a colony, presumably of the United States and the European Union. The Labour Party is still split on this issue, with its leader Jeremy Corbyn, with much more cautious left policies than those Tony Benn put forward, it's worth reminding ourselves, resisting the dominant pro-EU majority in the Labour Party and attempting to pull the party towards an unimpeded national British road to socialism. Harsh criticism, but it's the case if you examine it carefully enough. So let's look at this withdrawal agreement, what it was attempting to do and how it got tied up with the whole question of the Irish border. After months of negotiations, with further concessions having to be made by the British government, Prime Minister Theresa May was able finally to announce on the 14th of November 2018 that all aspects of the withdrawal transitional deal, including settling accounts, citizenship and the Irish border, had now been finalised and agreed at negotiator level. This agreement is essential if the UK is to retain the benefits of the single market and customs union for a further 21 months after leaving the EU on the 29th of March 2019. The transitional period itself, however, depends on the withdrawal deal being agreed and ratified by both the UK and EU parliaments. The negotiators have also agreed on the outline of a political declaration on the future UK-EU relationship. The initial published draft withdrawal agreement contained a default backstop solution written into the December 2017 agreement at the request of the Irish Republic, under which the North of Ireland would remain fully aligned with the EU single market and customs union. This was totally unacceptable to the Eurosceptics in the cabinet and to the Democratic Unionist Party, which the government relies upon to maintain a working majority in Parliament, as it is seen as threatening the constitutional integrity of the UK, and according to them, creating a customs and regularity border down the Irish Sea. We need to sort of say about this DUP that it's a thoroughly reactionary, nasty organisation, and it's not aligned with the people of the North of Ireland. For example, the people of the North of Ireland voted Remain by 55.8% and Leave by 44.2%. And today, around 60% of the population of the North of Ireland are looking towards a union with the Irish Republic in the European Union. So she has chosen to align the government with a thoroughly reactionary organisation that has not the majority support, and in fact has gone against the majority interests in the North of Ireland, and it's worth remembering this. Right. The backstop was accepted by the government with the proviso that both sides work towards technological and legal alternatives that will avoid this necessity. In other words, to find a way of conducting trade where a border between the North of Ireland and the South of Ireland, on the island of Ireland, was not necessary. Her Chequers proposal, if you remember that, was designed to do this, but was rejected by the EU negotiators and significant sections of her feuding party. In order to break the impasse in relation to the Irish border, and the Irish border is important because of the Good Friday Agreement, And the Good Friday Agreement is a peace agreement between the two sides in the struggle in the north of Ireland. And keeping peace on the island of Ireland is a crucial consideration normally for the British ruling class, amongst others, and of course the Irish Republic. Right. In order to break this impasse, in the period before the EU summit on the 17th and 18th of October, May attempted to get the EU to agree a temporary customs union between the whole of the UK and EU 27 member states to eliminate tariffs until a future trade agreement was in place. So one way of achieving this end, without the backstop, would be to have a full customs union between the UK and EU member states, so that a hard border between the two parts of Ireland would not be necessary. She faced an immediate backlash from Eurosceptic Tory MPs, including two cabinet ministers who were said to be on the verge of quitting on hearing that the Prime Minister was ready to sign a backstop plan that would see the whole of the UK stay in a temporary customs union without an end date. And in his inimitable style, attacking the plan, Jacob Rees-Mogg, arch Eurosceptic head of the 60-strong European research group of Tory MPs, said, "It is worth remembering that income tax was introduced as a temporary measure. Without an end date," he went on to say, "we could be in the customs union forever." May was facing a major cabinet revolt. The Prime Minister told her negotiators in Brussels to thrash out a new language for a proposed Brexit withdrawal agreement that would reassure Tory Eurosceptics that any backstop plan to avoid a hard border in Ireland could not lead to permanent membership of the EU customs union. The UK wants the arrangement to be temporary, but the EU refuses to set a firm end date for the arrangement. An official close to Eurosceptic ministers said at least 9 members of the cabinet would reject a customs union between the UK and the EU that had no end date, unless it explicitly set out how Britain could extricate itself. Now, the present 585-page draft withdrawal agreement, crushingly defeated in yesterday's Commons vote, contains a key concession that further infuriated many Brexiteers. Britain will not be able to unilaterally exit the backstop plan to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland. That decision will lie with a joint committee with an equal number of UK and EU representatives, as well as outside independent members. The EU and the UK will decide jointly within this committee that the backstop is no longer necessary. There would be no unilateral way to withdraw from the backstop. Now, Northern Ireland, or the north of Ireland as we like to call it, will be bound into a far deeper relationship with the EU than the rest of the UK. It must accept large parts of the single market rules and regulations overseen by Brussels and the European Court of Justice. The backstop will start at the end of Britain's transition period, at present December 2020, but it can be extended, it would appear now, to 2022. So all these things are, a long way off, and many things could have happened before they come, into operation. So the backstop only starts. This is really important to understand this. At the end of the transition period, because in the transition period, Britain is basically in the EU, in the single market and the customs union, right? Except it has no say on any new regulations that come out of the EU, because it's left the EU. So the backstop will start at the end of Britain's transition period until and unless alternatives are agreed. In other words, if there are no alternative technical, legal, whatever solutions to do away with the hard border in Ireland, then the backstop will come into operation. And that means that essentially the UK and the EU will have different regulations, particularly in relation to the single market situation. It includes an EU-UK customs union with accompanying restrictions on competition, environmental standards, tax and labour policy. The Democratic Unionist Party, whose votes the government relies on for its parliamentary majority, had made it clear that the withdrawal deal is not acceptable. The DUP's 10 MPs recently refused to support the government and abstained or backed Labour in a series of votes on the budget, breaking the so-called confidence and supply deal between the DUP and the Tory party. That is, for the DUP having been bribed with £1 billion to continue to support the Tory party in cases like
budgets, for example.
Yes, on all sorts of things, except it didn't do it on the budget, and it chose to do that in order to give a warning for the future, right, to the government. On Wednesday the 14th of November, May called an emergency meeting of a cabinet to sign off the long-awaited draft withdrawal deal. Ministers had been summoned to Downing Street during the previous evening, with some meeting individually with the Prime Minister or Chief of Staff. They were given the opportunity to read the 580-page withdrawal agreement. It's an insult, isn't it, really? A binding legal document of rights and obligations, as well as the 7-page aspirational outline of Britain's future relationship with the EU for the next stage of Brexit negotiations. That has no legal basis, by the way, this outline of Britain's future relationship. This document, by the way, was later worked on and expanded to 26 pages. They were not allowed to take any papers away, and further one-to-one meetings took place the next day. I don't know how you would read a 585-page document in EU, language, in such a short period of time. But there you go. Gestures. The Prime Minister clinched the support of a deeply divided cabinet for her Brexit deal after more than 5 hours of fraught and ferocious debate. Up to 11 cabinet ministers were said to have spoken against the deal, and the Work and Pensions Secretary Esther McVeigh voiced strong objections to the deal and warned of chaos if the government lost the meaningful vote on the deal in Parliament. Her request to hold a vote in the meeting was twice refused. On the night of the meeting, the Prime Minister came out of 10 Downing Street and made a statement. She said that the draft withdrawal agreement was the best that could be negotiated. When you strip away the detail, the choice before us is clear. This deal, which delivers on the vote of the referendum, which brings us back control of our money, laws and borders, ends free movement, protects jobs, security in our union, or take it, or leave with no deal, or no Brexit at all. She ended by saying, I firmly believe with my head and my heart that this is a decision that is in the best interests of the entire United Kingdom. In saying that no Brexit was one alternative to accepting her proposals, she gave some credibility to those arguing for a people's vote, a second referendum, with remaining in the EU as an option. Over the next 24 hours, 2 cabinet ministers resigned, the Brexit Secretary Dominic Raab and Esther McVeigh, along with 5 junior ministers. Now, in the run-up to the vote on the withdrawal agreement, May suffered further humiliation and defeat. On the 4th of December, she suffered 2 major Brexit defeats in one day. The start of the five-day debate on her deal was delayed as MPs passed a historic motion finding the government in contempt of Parliament for failing to publish in full the legal advice that they'd been given on Brexit. It had to be published the next day. The second major defeat was the passing of a cross-party amendment aimed at strengthening the hand of Parliament if the Brexit deal is voted down. Right. Any motion brought back to Parliament, if the deal is defeated, will have to be amendable. That's the deal. That's what was voted for. And that's a major change, because it means that Parliament is going to have the final say on the deal if the withdrawal deal is voted out, as of course we know it was. Remain campaigners were also jubilant at a European legal opinion by a senior legal advisor to the European Court of Justice that the UK could revoke Article 50 independently without needing the permission of every EU member state. Now, Article 50 of the Treaty of Lisbon gives any EU member state the right to quit unilaterally and outlines the procedure for doing it. If you revoke the deal, then you're no longer on the path of leaving the European Union. So the fact that Britain has the right to revoke the deal without the agreement of the other 27 members of the European Union was regarded as really important by the so-called Remainers in Parliament. May went on a tour of European capitals to plead for a better Brexit deal after being forced at the 11th hour to abort a planned vote on a Brexit deal due on the 11th of December, after it became clear she would be massively defeated. The vote was eventually delayed until yesterday, the 15th of January 2019. May had earlier infuriated many Tory MPs and business leaders by introducing a post-Brexit immigration white paper to slash EU immigration. It centred on tough visa restrictions on unskilled migrants from the EU and a 30,000 minimum salary for migrants to enter the UK from the EU as highly skilled workers. This was seen to have a potentially dire consequence of serious damage to the already fragile British economy, which, as we know, depends on a very low-paid workforce, many in the so-called gig economy. Okay, now the acrimonious split in a party was further demonstrated when the necessary 48 letters needed from Tory MPs were put forward to allow a confidence vote in her leadership of the party on the 12th of December. She won a Pyrrhic victory by 200 to 117 votes, confirming essentially the irreconcilable split in the party. That was only a victory of 83 votes in the Tory party. Rees-Mogg, the instigator of the attempted coup, said it was a terrible result for May and she should resign. I mean, a couple of weeks later he was saying the opposite, that he would now support Theresa May, but that's Jacob Rees-Mogg. There's no consistency in Jacob Rees-Mogg, but yeah, has good jokes in my view. For For this vote, the whip was restored to a pair of MPs who had been accused of sexually inappropriate behaviour and had had the whip removed. In other words, no principles, anything goes, we have to win this vote, right? And after the vote, and this is quite interesting, May pledged to stand down before the mandated election in 2022. Is it June 2022?
Just 5 years, isn't it?
Yeah, so it must be June, yeah. So she's not going to stand in the next election, which gives great hopes to a lot of useless people in the Tory party. May wanted a 12-month limit on her Irish backstop. The EU would not agree to a legal guarantee on this. Assurances before the vote on a Brexit deal in a letter from the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker and Donald Tusk, the European Council President, was to no avail, as it simply stated that they expected use of the backstop to be replaced as quickly as possible. That's all their letter said. It did not have the legal force the DUP and the arch-Brexiters sought. May suffered two further defeats: an anti-no deal amendment by a cross-party alliance to the budget finance bill restricting changes to tax law in a no-deal Brexit. That was passed by 303 votes to 296. And what that means essentially is, they couldn't pass laws to finance whatever was necessary for a no-deal Brexit, like military, paying millions of pounds to a company to set up a ferry in Ramsgate, has never done anything like it before, has no ships or anything. But this is what happens. May was the first Prime Minister for 41 years to lose a vote on a government finance bill. A second defeat in 24 hours came from a vote requiring May to produce a Brexit Plan B within 3 parliamentary sitting days if she loses the vote on her withdrawal deal. Eurosceptic MPs were furious that the Speaker had allowed the vote to take place, because normally the government itself determines the kind of procedures that are necessary to have a vote on these questions. In the meantime, the Prime Minister, this is getting crazy, phoned union leaders to seek their support for her deal, including Unite's Len McCluskey and the GMB's Tim Roach. And this, of course, was the first time since the start of her premiership that she'd spoken to them. I mean, she had total contempt for the union movement and had never spoken to these people before, but she now thought she needed them. She told them the deal was good for protecting jobs and it guarantees environmental and workers' rights. They could hardly be convinced. The inevitable consequences of her inability to make compromises on the red lines governing her withdrawal deal led to the overwhelming defeat of that deal when put before the House of Commons. So that's, what has more or less happened. We're up to date now. We know that the vote of no confidence was not passed. The government won that. And so let's get to what really matters. What is the root of the crisis? The problem is a Tory party hopelessly divided, yet determined to hold on to political power. It should be remembered that the referendum held in June 2016 was called by the then Prime Minister David Cameron in an attempt to contain the deep splits in the Tory party over Europe, exacerbated by the challenge of the United Kingdom Independence Party, i.e. UKIP, and its anti-EU stance and racist immigration policy, and to strike a populist pose to improve its party's prospects in the next general election. Today, Theresa May's minority government is irrecoverably divided on Brexit, Brexit, desperately holding on to power with the support of the deeply reactionary pro-Brexit DUP. While this is the impetus behind the deadlock negotiations, it's not its root cause, and that is grounded in the relative decline of British capitalism facing a global economic crisis and growing imperialist rivalry. The decision of US President Donald Trump to pull out of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal on the 8th of May 2018 and impose further sanctions on Iran and countries and companies trading with Iran, an expression, we could say, of his American first nationalism, itself is a response to the relative economic decline of US imperialism and represents a serious threat from the United States to a European imperialism potentially weakened by the growing conflict over Brexit. The EU has to decide whether to hit back against the threat of sanctions from the US and revive the EU blocking regulation, a response that enabled the EU to prevail over extraterritorial US sanctions to deter trade with Cuba, Iran and Libya in the 1990s. That regulation prohibited EU entities and courts from complying with and enforcing a list of foreign sanction laws, raising the prospect of financial penalties for companies that do comply. It will be more difficult this time because of the deeper links between European companies and the US financial system and the threat of large fines, criminal charges and asset seizures against such companies in the US. There is a lot at stake, and the EU has to determine how it will respond to this growing challenge from a rival imperialist power. At a dinner before a meeting of the 28 European leaders, including British Prime Minister Theresa May in Sofia, Bulgaria on the 16th of May, the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, began to address this issue when he said, "We are witnessing today a new phenomenon, the capricious assertiveness of the American administration." He condemned the US withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal and its threat of a transatlantic trade war, that's with China. Tusk drew lessons from this. "I have no doubt that in the new global game, Europe will either be one of the major players or a pawn. This is the only real alternative. In order to be the subject and not the object of global politics, Europe must be united economically, politically, and also militarily like never before. To put it simply, either we are together or we will not be at all." That's Donald Tusk stating what his attitude to this growing rivalry between the US and the EU. A significant response to this development came later in the year from Jean-Claude Juncker, President of the European Commission, in his last State of the Union speech to MEPs in Strasbourg on the 12th of September 2018. In it, he proposed to turn the euro into a global reserve currency that would rival the dollar as part of a drive to reduce its dependence on the United States. He said it was absurd that Europe pays for 80% of its energy import bill, worth 300 billion euros a year, in US dollars, when only roughly 2% of EU's energy imports comes from the US. He continued, "It's absurd that European companies buy European planes in dollars instead of euros. An initiative was needed," he said, "from the European Central Bank to promote the international use of the euro." This demand signals Europe's alarm at Trump's moves to use the dollar as a weapon of foreign policy to punish US imperialism's rivals. The EU has said early in the year that it will switch from dollars to euros to pay for Iranian oil imports in response to the conflict with the US over the Iranian nuclear deal. And on 21st of August last year, Germany's Foreign Minister Heike Maas said, "It is indispensable that we strengthen European autonomy by creating payment channels that are independent of the United States." In his speech, Juncker outlined the steps to be taken to create from the EU a European imperialism able to stand up to the US. He said, "The geopolitical situation makes this Europe's hour. The time for European sovereignty has come. It is time Europe took its destiny in its own hands. It is time Europe developed what I coined, this is the word, Weltpolitikfähigkeit, which is the capacity to play a role as a union in shaping global affairs. Europe has to become a more sovereign actor in international relations." As we have consistently pointed out, the parasitic character of British capitalism has made it increasingly incapable of withstanding the economic and political challenge of US or European imperialism as an independent global imperialist power. The Brexit conflict is essentially a dispute between sections of the ruling class over two necessarily totally reactionary outcomes for British capitalism: staying as part of a European imperialist bloc or leaving and becoming an offshore centre for usury capital under the umbrella of US imperialism. In addition, Brexit is creating serious obstacles to sustaining the City of London as a leading global financial centre, and with it the material basis for the standard of living of the more privileged sections of the working class. In July, Deutsche Bank shifted half its euro clearing activities from London to Frankfurt. Recently, EY, used to be called Ernst & Young, EY has said that something like £800 billion of money is being transferred from foreign banks based in London to Europe. And there's all sorts of developments of this kind taking place, so that our argument that the City of London will start to be undermined in this whole process as banking capital moves to new financial centres because of what is happening in relation to Brexit. So Brexit is creating serious obstacles to sustaining the City of London as a leading global financial centre, and with it the material basis, as I've argued, for the standard of living of the more privileged sections of the working class. I've got many statistics if we have time, and I'll show you how significant this is in terms of the amounts of money as a percentage of the GDP that's involved in these processes. In this context, it's not surprising that Trump's America First nationalism and the growing US conflict with Europe are driving the opportunist tendencies in the British Labour movement towards staying within or as close as possible to a European imperialist bloc. Corbyn supporter, journalist and commentator Paul Mason expresses this development clearly when he says, "If Brexit was a crack in the superstructure of globalisation, Trump has aimed a wrecking ball at its foundations. As the world fragments into conflicting trade and finance blocs, it is imperative for both geographic and cultural reasons for Britain to attach itself closely to Europe as possible." I mean, he could have added, and for the privileged living standards of people like me, Paul Mason and others that work in the British media. With Trump in power, being inside the single market has become the only logical option for a Labour government, even if that might make some of its plans for state ownership, state aid and workplace regulation more difficult to achieve. This was, in essence, the position that was adopted at the September 2018 Labour Party conference. The composite motion that was passed not only called for a relationship with the EU that guarantees full participation in the single market, but also rejected a no-deal Brexit and supported all options remaining on the table, including campaigning for a public vote, that is a second referendum, if Labour could not force a general election. Keir Starmer, introducing the motion, made it clear that the question of a public vote should be an open one, with remaining in the EU an option. In addition, any deal signed by the May government with the EU had to satisfy 6 tests which Starmer set out in 2017. These include a strong and collaborative future relationship with the EU, delivering exactly the same benefits as currently exist for members of the Single Market and Customs Union. I mean, one's response to that is then you'll have to stay in the European Union. I mean, it just logically follows. Labour's compromise position is both reactionary and unrealisable. As has been argued already, we totally reject taking sides in what is essentially a dispute between sections of the ruling class over what would be for Britain necessarily totally reactionary outcomes, part of a European imperialist bloc, or becoming an offshore centre for usury capital under the umbrella of US imperialism. The only principal communist position is to expose the reactionary intentions of those on either side of this debate. There is no shortcut. We must use the chaotic situation to continue to build an anti-imperialist movement in this country and open the path for communists to link up with those other forces in Europe fighting against European imperialism.